Holland. Like Flanders, I think it was Flanders and Holland. But anyways, they wound up in Holland, and they formed a church there. And my wife and I went there one time and visited, and there's parts of the original church there that the Pilgrims had their congregation in. It's amazing, you know. And they left from there. When they left from there, they left on the Mayflower, obviously, and who was in charge of that group on the Mayflower was a reverend. I think his name was Reverend Brown, but he was the leader at the time, you know, of the congregation. And that day, the Mayflower left with another ship called the Speedwell, and my progenitor ancestor was on the Speedwell, the second ship. They left together with the Mayflower. The Speedwell developed problems and had to return to port. So that section of people, the Pilgrims came on, and you know the rest of that story with the Mayflower. The Speedwell, the group that was chartered on the Speedwell, had to wait about almost a year to the day, and they left on a ship called the Fortune. And they came here about a year after the Pilgrims got here. So that's how, you know, and they were escaping religious persecution. That's what they were doing at the time. They wanted to form a new country where they could practice their religions freely, you know. And from that, you know, if you fast forward the Revolutionary War and all of that stuff against the Church of England, and they were being persecuted, is where we got our Constitution, Bill of Rights, and all of that. And now, look at what we have today. It's just flipped right around. I mean, it's this country was formed to prevent exactly what's going on today. All our, you know, our Constitution, Bill of Rights, and all of that. It was a Christian nation. That's what it was formed to be, and now they're denying that it's a Christian nation. It's like, oh, we're a conglomerate, this and that. Well, no, they can't water it down. It's either a Christian nation or it's not. You know, and I don't know who it was. Maybe John Adams, one of those people, said that, or maybe Ben Franklin, I don't remember, but he said that the Constitution would be no good for a non-Bible believing people. It was written for a Bible believing people. And if you didn't have a Bible believing people, the Constitution was basically worthless. And that's what we're seeing today. You know, we're not seeing a Bible believing people. They're rising up, and what boggles my mind is that how can you have an 80% Christian nation and still have this stuff going on? You know, that minority faction of the country, the non-Christian, I think it's 20%, maybe 13% non-Christian, profess to be non-Christian, atheist, whatever, are having that much clout today to destroy our Constitution. It's just, it's like somebody put a veil over everybody's eyes and say, you know, like we're just going around living our lives, you know, because it's simpler. But and this is what's happening off to the side that we're not even paying attention to. And if you and it's not. If it was one big movement at one time, it would have been another revolution, but it's not. It's a little trickle here, a little trickle there, a little trickle there. All of a sudden you wake up one morning and say, hey, what happened to that? You know, it was like, and it's, if you go to sleep, you better believe that the enemy is not sleeping, and he continues his thing, you know, and we have a tendency to just back off and just kind of get lackadaisical and go to sleep, you know, and while they're still working, you know, so it's just amazing how that happens. But let's see what's going on. Let's see. So we get into that. There's no such thing as separation of church and state, but where is it? There was absolutely, if you read Jefferson's letters and stuff like that, there was absolutely no question about his intent or the founding fathers' intentions. There was no question about it whatsoever. You know, and you're telling me, now I was a judge for 4 years. I had to make decisions on certain things back and forth, and if I didn't know, if I'm not a lawyer, so a lot of times the lawyers could snooker me, see, because I'm not a lawyer. I'm not as sharp, in law. But what I would do is I would hold back. So let's recess for 10 minutes. I go back in my office where I had a whole wall full of books that I could look up to make sure that I was sharp as that guy, see, and I was making the right decisions. And there's no way you could tell me that a federal judge cannot look up the original record and see what the Founding Fathers' intents were. They know what the intent was. But so the only logical explanation is that they are purposely distorting it and turning it upside down. Because there's no other logical explanation. I mean, you say, oh, a federal judge, he made that decision. Well, wait a minute, that's a stupid decision. I don't care if you're a federal judge or not, You'd be the president of the United States. They make a lot of stupid decisions, Time to, when you call them on it, they got to turn around and back off and do the right thing, But these federal judges refuse to do that. And there should be some kind of a process, and it should be more available, to remove these people from the bench when they make those type of decisions that are blatantly wrong and in your face type of thing, And I just wanted to run through this real quick. Everything for, I think it was about 150 years, was the Supreme Court upheld those rulings that there is no church or state, that the government is to protect the free exercise of religion, no matter what it was. Up until, I think it's 1853, a group of people sent a petition to Congress urging the separation of Christian principles from the government. And it was a simple petition sent to Congress asking them, they wanted chaplains to be removed from Congress and the military. They quoted the phrase separation of church and state, using that. And they're saying, well, but we have separation of church and state, so we should remove the chaplains from the Congress and military. And they wanted government not to protect religion in the public arena, but to remove it from the public arena. That's what they requested, okay? Now that was 1853. Up until that time, nobody ever questioned the intent of the Founding Fathers. There was no, even to this day, if you read them, you can't question the intent. We know what the intent was, And let's see. There was, at that time, U.S. Congress spent over a year reviewing that possibility, the petition, and emphatically rejected it. A year later, in 1854, they declared that the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, but not any one denomination. In this age, there is no substitute for Christianity. That was the religion of the founders of the Republic, and they expected it to remain the religion of their descendants. Now that's what the Supreme Court ruled in 1854 in response to that petition. And there was no way the Congress at the time was going to use the First Amendment to secularize the public square. And the Congress in 1856, 2 years later, they come out with a statement that says the great, vital, and conservative element in our system, that is the thing that holds our system together, is the belief of our people in the pure doctrines and divine truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That was written by our Congress in 1856. How do you go from that to this, what we got now? I don't get it, It's again, Congress refused to separate Christian principles from the public arena. And 1878, fast forward about 20 years, and There was plaintiffs that invoked separation of church and state. Here we go. Now we're hearing separation of church and state, separation of church and state, which is never in the original document. They're referring to a letter that was written, a private letter from Jefferson. So people keep bringing it up. The court did not allow them to quote Jefferson out of context in 1878. They wouldn't allow that separation of church and state. They read the whole letter that Jefferson wrote and determined its intent was to protect religious freedom, not prevent it. So they upheld it in 1878. So they maintained that position that the First Amendment was written to protect religious freedoms and the exercise thereof, not prevent anything, right? So that was in 1878. For 7 decades, that's how the country ruled. That's how the Supreme Court ruled. 70 years. That's how it stayed, just like that. Religious freedoms were to be protected by the government, not prevented by the government. In 1947, you fast forward, there was a lawsuit, Jefferson versus the Board of Education, and the Supreme Court cited Jefferson's separation metaphor out of context. They didn't take the whole letter into context. They just took separation of church and state. And they ignored the rest of the letter, okay? And this is in 1947. They boldly announced a new policy, quote, "The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve of the slightest breach." That's when we lost the First Amendment, religious freedoms, was in 1947. That Supreme Court, at the time, now, you gotta grasp it that for 150 years, there was no question about the intent of the Founding Fathers until 1947, and a group of men in black robes, 9 people, ruled that against 90, now at that time, 97% of this country professed to be Christians in some form or another, some denomination or another. 97%. And the Supreme Court, 9 guys in black robes, decided to go against the wishes of that 97% and boldly proclaim that that the First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state to prevent. They totally flipped the meaning and took the letter out of context. It's something that just never was in the Constitution. Now the Supreme Court exists to interpret the Constitution. What did they mean? There was no question about that aspect of it until these guys decided that we're just going to go and do this. 97% of the country, and they got away with it. And that's when it changed to what we have today. That was just shocking when I found that out. And it said no longer would Jefferson's phrase protect religious expressions, as it had the previous 150 years. It would now become a mandate to exclude religious expressions and to secularize the public square. That's where they removed Christianity from the public square. And again, the supporters in authority repeated the phrase so often that many began to believe that the phrase separation of church and state was actually part of the First Amendment. And they fulfilled that quote from Dr. Williams from years ago, saying if you repeat it enough, it becomes, people will believe it. And that's what happened. In 1962, the Supreme Court in Engel versus Vitale began instituting a policy of public secularization by striking down a prayer. The prayer was, "Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessing upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country." The court determined that this prayer was defined as a to whom it may concern prayer because it only acknowledged God once, and as a result, they ordered separation of religious principles from education. They ruled it was unconstitutional for a student to say a voluntary prayer in school. That included, and there's a long list that affected, said let's see. That's when they basically incorporated and said, you have to do this. You cannot say prayers in school. You cannot, there was even a case of a student couldn't bow his head and silently say a prayer. Now, how can you rule that? You don't know what the students, it's like the thing with the marching band. I mean, you don't know, it's music. It's not, and you're going to rule that he can't have a silent prayer? I mean, it's mind-boggling. And, see, the 1892 Supreme Court decision stated Christian principles must remain the basis for American laws and institutions. This 1892 decision was based on 80 precedents. When 1892, that Supreme Court ruled that the government was to protect religious freedom, not prevent it. They did their homework, and they based it on 80 precedents in the Constitution and life in general, cases, court cases and that. 80 precedences that upheld the fact that the government was to protect religious freedoms, not prevent it. The 1962 decision has 0 precedents. They based their decision solely on what they thought it should be, going against 97% of the country at the time. It's shocking. And the court at that time in 1963 or 62, the court ignored the actual wording of the Constitution. The court set aside precedents, deciding cases on precedents. When you go to court, normally what happens if a judge rules on a case, after that case, and another case comes up that's similar, they could refer to that case, say, oh, the judge ruled here, that it upheld it, so I have to uphold it because there's a precedent, It was heard before, and somebody decided it before. This whole thing was decided on no precedent. They set aside so now judges can make rulings, federal judges can make rulings, without ever having another precedent set. Even though somebody ruled against it 10 years ago, they could reverse that and go against it because they don't care about the precedent. The court elevated the phrase from a private letter, mind you, not the Constitution. They elevated that phrase to be part of the Constitution by implied. They implied, most people now, if you think, and they don't teach it in a lot of schools that I know of, that most people, if you ask them, church and state, they truly believe that it's in the Constitution. That's because they kept on saying it over and over and over. And today, these groups say it over and over and over again. And they act like it's the truth. Well, what does God say? The truth will set you free. That is not the truth. It's a lie. And we hear it every day. We hear that lie. And, it's disgusting what's going on today. The court's animosity toward public prayer continued and expanded with the 1985 Supreme Court that ruled unconstitutional the praying of a silent voluntary prayer in school. Now, how would they know what you're praying? But they ruled it unconstitutional. You can't stand in a school, bow your head, and have a silent prayer. It's bizarre. And 1947 was the tipping point. 1962 was the nail on the coffin for the First Amendment. Let's see. Oh, one second. It's in the Bible, 1 Samuel 2, verse 30. You don't have to look it up. I'll read it for you. I printed it out here. But may every citizen, Sam Adams was quoting from the Bible, and he made a statement. Samuel Adams, one of the founding fathers, John Adams' cousin, said, "May every citizen in the country have a proper sense of the deity upon his mind and an impression of the declaration recorded in the Bible." And the quote from the Bible was, "Him that honoreth me, I will honor," the God speaking. "But he that despiseth me shall be lightly esteemed," meaning he won't be honored. So, and George Mason was another founding father. He signed the Bill of Rights. He said, "As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this world, punished in this world, by an inevitable chain of causes and effects. Providence punishes national sins by national calamities." He's George Mason, father of the Bill of Rights. You can look up his. But one of the things let's see. One of the points that I wanted to bring out in all of this was that there's another lie going on, so that we hear quite often, and it has to do with churches and politics. Okay, oh, you can't have politics in the church. You can't discuss politics in the church. You can't. And what's behind that is that a church's tax status, the 501c, I think it is. But basically, what it says is that a church cannot endorse a candidate, a specific candidate. That's basically what it says. Or they can lose their tax status. All right. It doesn't say you can't preach politics from the pulpit. It doesn't say that you can't preach morals and all of that type of thing, because a lot of people today are so fed up with politics and politicians, lying politicians. They get you try and talk to them. Oh, I don't want to talk politics. Don't talk politics. I'm getting. Please don't say that. I'm fed up with politics. Politics is an integral part of the church, whether you like it or not. And what Christians do in regards to politics affects the nation as a whole. And if we're supposed to be 80% professed to be a Christian nation, now that's the last figure I could come up with, about 80% professed to be Christian. Back then it was 97% when they flipped that law. 80%, now stop and think about this, and I think about it because I ran for the state senate one time. I had to run an election for a judge and this and that. And so I didn't like politics either many moons ago. As a cop, I could care less what the politician did, other than were they going to give me a raise or not. That's all I care about politics. But if you don't get involved in politics, the enemy is involved in politics, whether you are or not. And that's what's going to affect the politics of this nation. And the lackadaisical nature of Christians in general, not to want confrontation or that type of thing, is, I believe, what led to where we're at today. Since 1962, that ruling by the Supreme Court. Look what's happened since. I was thinking about one time, when I was about 15 years old. Me and two other guys that I grew up with. One was 16 and two of us were 15. We decided we were going to run away from home. We're going to go to Florida, right? So the three of us take off. We just started walking down Broadway. We just kept on going, We made it to Genesee County. And what happened was, it's a funny story actually, but now out that way, that was like, this was the country back then. This was like, so that was like real rural area, right? So we're walking down Broadway, the side of the road, on the stones there, and there's tractor trailers coming by. They're practically blowing us off the road. It was amazing. We were trying to hitch a ride, and we got fed up. And about maybe 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, we turned around, went on the other side of the street, and we started heading back home again because it was cold and well, anyways, we get, and there wasn't that many vehicles going by. Well, one of my brilliant friends flagged down the next car that came by. Hey, like this, right? Well, the car pulls over. Basically had to, unless you would have hit him or go over. But he the guy, we see the light go on in the car. The trooper puts the Stetson on. It was a trooper car, right? So he puts us in the back seat, reads us the riot act, blah blah blah, and we had about $20 between us, right? We had big bucks back then, Now, this is about I want to say 67, something like that. And it was funny because those two guys I wound up joining the Marines with in 1968 under the buddy system, but the buddy system wasn't what they told us it was. But anyway, at the time, but put that aside. But now it's about 2 or 3 in the morning. The troopers, now another trooper car shows up. They take us to a judge's house at about 3 o'clock in the morning and ring the judge's doorbell. Guy comes out in a robe. He's got a desk out on his sun porch out there in the country somewhere, and they wrote us a ticket called for soliciting a ride, they called it, right? So now the penalty for soliciting a ride is 5 days in jail or $25 fine, all right? And the judge is adjudicating this right there in his sun porch in his robe. How do you plead, And he found us guilty and fined us 5 days in jail or $25 fine each. We didn't have $25, and I think they knew that. The troopers probably told them that. So they put us in jail. Now we're 15 years old. They put us in Genesee County Jail for 5 days, and we spent they let us out a half a day early, and we couldn't wait to get on the Greyhound back to Buffalo. But at the time, we were punks anyways. But it was good we were off the street for 5 days. But at the time, they how you go to jail, if you're, I'm sure none of you have been in jail, but you get a phone call. You want a phone call? Should we call your mother or this and that? Because I was afraid to get my rear end kicked when I went home. So that's where I sat. I didn't know my mother had like an all points bulletin out, like to pick me up, because I was missing person, And they didn't know it either for some reason at the jail. They didn't have computer systems like we have today. So that's where I sat. Three of us, we sat and we played matchbook football for for 5 days. And, so anyways, we came back and all of that, and we wound up all joining the service together. And but I'm thinking, look at some of the stuff that's going on today. That's how strict in the 60s. That was a big thing for us to get arrested for soliciting a ride, which is basically a traffic ticket. But you couldn't even hitch a ride back then. And now you got people walking around the streets with clubs, smashing windows, burning buildings, and all of this stuff. I don't see anybody going to jail, I mean, it's amazing the difference between the 60s and what we've evolved into since then, as far as the legal system and all of that stuff, It's just crazy. And it's one of the things is, I think that look at some of the stuff that's taken place. How does a Christian nation, 80% Christian, how do you get a candidate that's pro-abortion? I don't understand that. How do they get elected? That means over half of the Christians that say they're Christians are pro-abortion. How does that work with the Bible? I don't understand it, And and I just believe that we keep hearing this stuff over and over again, and the gospel gets watered down, and we just accept it, Oh, okay, that's just another thing going on, and we just go about our business. But I say it all that, say that Christians need to get involved in politics. They need to hold their representatives accountable, and the whole thing about a representative government, which we have, is that we elect people that represent our ideals, our morals. They represent us when we put them in office, and they go to the Washington or wherever and fight for us, for our beliefs, for our values. Half of the guys I voted for, they're not upholding my values or my beliefs. They went off after they told me they were gonna. They went up there and they did whatever they feel like doing, just like the Supreme Court did back then. There's 9 guys decided, hey, I don't care. I don't care about you. I don't care. This is the way I see it, you know. And it's time that Christians stood up. As I'm not saying go bashing heads in or stop burning buildings or anything, but we can make a difference if we band together and vote the right people in with Christian values back into office and get rid of the ones that are in there that are not doing the job. You know, back in the founding fathers' day, they go to they had to beg them to serve in Washington. Say, hey, I got a firm. How can I go there and represent the people? You know, it's your civic duty. They went and did it. They took a loss on their firm to represent their group of people, their community in Washington. And now you can't get them out of there with a crowbar. You can't get them out of Congress. They were in there for life, and that's it. They die in there. You know, look at some of them. Been in there 30 years, 35 years. You know, you got to get them out. You know, has to be term limits and all of that stuff. You can get into all of that, but you know, I mean, that's where it's gotten. I think it's time to, you know, put your finger in the dike and say, hey, I got to make myself uncomfortable for the good of the nation. You know, and that's what Christians, I think, need to be doing. You know, along with prayer and, you know, the obvious things. You know, but just a couple statistics and then we'll close. Now this stuff doesn't necessarily mean that flip in the Constitution in 1962 caused all this stuff. But here's some of the stuff just to keep, you know, put in your mind, you know, what's happened since 1963. Before 63, divorce rates have been declining for 15 years. After 1963, divorce increased 300% each year for the next 15 years. Believe that? Now, I'm not saying that constitutional ruling did it, but, you know, who knows, you know? And who knows if taking prayer out of schools had something to do with that, you know? Since 1963, unmarried people living together is up 353%. Says education standard of measure. I always like the SAT scores. Everybody hears the SAT scores, right? All these, and that's how they gauge, you know, I guess education. I wasn't ever that familiar with them, but I never took a SAT. But it said the educational standard of measure has been the SAT scores. SAT scores had been steady for many years before 1963. From 1963, they rapidly declined.